They say you can only get shocked once before your body learns the memory forever. I never believed that. Not until the morning the HOA's hired guard dropped me to my knees with a crackle of electricity, while a dying woman lay just 100 feet away. You think about that distance every time you walk it. 100 feet, 30 steps if you're calm, 20 if you're running. But when there's an iron gate in the middle, and a man with a badge that isn't really a badge, it might as well be a mile. It was just after sunrise, that soft Florida light that makes even gas stations look almost poetic. The kind of morning where the air smells like wet grass and exhaust, and you can almost pretend life is gentle. We run hundreds of calls like this before: possible cardiac arrest, older female, Maple Ridge Preserve. My partner was driving, one hand loose on the wheel like she'd done it 1,000 times. And me? I was already running through the checklist in my head. CPR, airway, shocks if we had to. The kind of rhythm you cling to when seconds decide if a stranger lives or dies. We rolled in quiet, siren low. 6:40 in the morning, too early for lawsuits over spilled coffee, too late for excuses. The iron gates of Maple Ridge came into view, perfectly polished, catching that rose-colored sunlight. Usually they swung open before we even slowed down. Not this time. This time the gate blinked red, closed. And there he was, a man planted in front of the keypad like he'd been waiting all night just for us. Feet spread, shoulders squared. His uniform was that odd, cheap green you only ever see on fake Christmas trees, his red Mercer. Above it, the word security, stitched like it was supposed to mean something. I dropped my window, badge out so close he could read the expiration date. EMS Unit 1117, I said, clear as a bell. Cardiac arrest, open the gate. He didn't move, he just looked at me the way you'd look at a solicitor who won't leave your porch. Then he said it, calm, flat, like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. "Do you have an access code, ma'am?" I could feel the seconds bleeding out. Was already on the radio, dialing the management number listed in our scene guide. I unclipped my belt and stepped out, my boots crunching against the decorative gravel they probably paid a landscaper too much to keep spotless. "Sir, you're obstructing an emergency responder. That's a felony. Move aside." He put a hand on the taser strapped to his hip like it was a nervous dog he had to keep calm. "No clearance, no entry." His voice didn't shake. It didn't even sound cruel. Just tired, certain, like he honestly believed those words would save him from something. I pointed to the ambulance, the flashing lights, the red cross on the hood the size of a beach towel. "We have a dying patient," I said. "Open the damn gate." And then it hit. A sound like lightning tripping over my ribs, a white-hot pain that swallowed everything at once. The ground slammed into me, grass pressed against my cheek, perfectly trimmed, perfectly watered, the kind of lawn these residents bragged about in their HOA newsletters. I tried to shout, but electricity steals your voice first. It negotiates with your lungs before it ever lets your brain catch up. Somewhere behind that gate I heard it, a woman's voice, no, not a voice. A sound. The kind a body makes when the heart is giving up. Later, I'd learn her name was Hart, but in that moment I didn't see her face. I saw the gate. I saw Mercer's boots planted firm like he was standing on sacred ground. I saw vault out of the rig, radio in one hand, fury in her voice, and then silence swallowing the whole street. Died at 6:53. The coroner gave her husband that number like he was reading it off a clock. We reached the gate at 6:43. 10 minutes lost to one man and one manual. 10 minutes that could have been oxygen in her brain, blood in her veins, another sunrise in her life. That night I sat in my one-bedroom apartment, the smell of coffee and bleach hanging in the air. I held an ice pack to my shoulder, trying to calm the tremor in my handwriting as I filled out the incident report. But nothing quieted the sound in my head. That zap, like a wasp trapped in a jar, buzzing in my bones. Every time a neighbor's bug zapper flickers in the summer, I feel my muscles tighten before I even realize why. And here's the truth nobody tells you. It isn't the pain that lingers. It's the silence after. The silence where a woman's cries slipped through a gate while we stood helpless on the other side, arguing with a man who thought a binder carried more weight than a human life. Sometimes I wonder, if you'd been there standing beside me, would you have raised your voice louder? Or would you have stayed quiet, afraid of rules, afraid of consequence? That's the question that's haunted me ever since Maple Ridge, and it's only the beginning. Grief doesn't knock. It just opens the door and sits heavy in the room until you can barely breathe. 2 days after Hart died, I met her husband. He answered the door like a man unlocking a vault, like every ounce of warmth left in his house was behind that frame. The first thing I noticed wasn't his face, it was the stillness. A teacup with lipstick on the rim. A crossword puzzle stopped mid-clue. A pair of reading glasses folded on top of a cookbook that would never be opened again. A house paused in the middle of a life. Didn't try to be strong. He didn't put on a mask for me. He just looked at me and said, "Where were you?" And I said the only words I could, "Right there." We stood in that hallway, the air humming with the kind of silence that cuts deeper than any question. I told him what happened, every detail. How we pulled up at 6:43, how Mercer blocked us, how I held my badge against the glass until my arm shook, how the world turned white when he fired the taser. I didn't sugarcoat it and didn't flinch at the word taser. No, what made him break was when I said the word gate. He whispered it like a curse. I had a key fob for 15 years. The day it mattered most, I could thrown it like a stone, maybe reached you faster. That's when his lawyer showed up. Not the kind you see on TV with sharp suits and theatrics. No. Walked in wearing crisp slacks and work boots like she could argue a case and build a fence in the same afternoon. She spread a stack of papers across the kitchen table, open records requests, HOA newsletters, training manuals. One page made my stomach go cold. It was a policy manual from a company called Aegis Sentinel. Page 12, subsection C in black and white text. It read, "In any situation involving unverified entry attempts, on-duty guards are authorized to apply non-lethal deterrence when verbal escalation fails." That sentence wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was design. Someone somewhere signed off on the idea that a checklist was more important than a pulse, that a taser was more valuable than a human life. Tapped the page with her finger. "Everyone's going to want Mercer's head," she said. "And he'll answer for what he did, but if we stop there, the machine that trained him keeps running. This was built, not random, not rogue." Straightened in his chair, spine stiffening like someone had slid a steel bar down his back. "I don't want a check," he said quietly. "I want this never to happen again, and I want the people who voted for this to feel what it cost." Meanwhile, the HOA board did what boards always do when cameras start pointing their way. They booked the clubhouse, brewed bad coffee, and practiced their sorry faces in the mirror. But not everyone played along. One night found an unmarked manila envelope slipped under her office door. Inside was the complete security protocol, signed, dated, and stamped with a name that made my stomach clench. Philip Drake, HOA President. It wasn't vague. It wasn't open to interpretation. It had a color-coded arrows and under a column labeled deterrence options. The word taser in bold, capital letters, like they were proud of it. Proud. The next morning, flyers started appearing on mailboxes all up and down Maple Ridge. Simple, quiet words, justice for, reform the board, protect the next life. And there he was, the man who lost his wife, standing by the same iron gate that had trapped her, holding a hand-lettered sign. Cars slowed. Some drivers stared at him like he was a ghost. Some rolled their windows up, but not everyone drove past. A retired Marine named stopped and signed the petition with a pen that shook in his hand. A widow from Lilac Terrace added her name, whispering, "She brought lemon squares to Bridge Night." The trickle became a line. That's when the threats started. At the station, I opened my locker and found a plain envelope with no stamp, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper typed in 12-point Times New Roman, "Stay out of it. Drop the statement. Next time it won't be a taser." I've had knives waved in my face by men so drunk they couldn't remember their own names. But this hit different. Cold, calculated, like someone had the time to think about how best to scare me. I snapped a photo of it, sent it to. She called the DA before my phone's screen even dimmed. "They're rattled," she said, her voice calm, but I could hear the edge behind it. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about anymore. This wasn't just one death, one mistake. This was about a system that had chosen fear over mercy, rules over lives. When the lawsuit came, it didn't arrive politely. It kicked the door off its hinges. Wrongful death, negligence, obstruction. And every exhibit, the emails, the board minutes, the HOA newsletters painted the same picture. They hadn't just failed Hart, they planned for it. And in that planning, they wrote her death into policy. Courtrooms are colder than ambulances. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that makes your teeth click together even if the thermostat swears it's 70 degrees. The day I took the stand, I felt that cold crawl under my uniform and sit there. The prosecutor asked simple questions. What did I see? What did I do? Did I raise my voice, make a threatening gesture? No, sir, I was standing still. He asked me what the taser felt like. I told him, like every nerve in my body got convinced by a stranger. For 30 seconds, I didn't belong to myself. A juror wiped her eye. And for the first time since that morning, I realized the sound that haunted me wasn't mine to carry alone anymore. Next, she told them about the watch commander number that rang and rang, about the gate that blinked red whilst life drained away on the other side. Then came the neighbor's video, doorbell footage that caught me collapsing on that perfectly trimmed lawn, the ambulance lights pulsing against iron bars. Silence filled the courtroom as the jurors watched, silence that felt like judgment. Finally, they called Mercer. He walked in wearing a suit that didn't fit, sitting forward like the chair might spit him out if he leaned back. His hands kept folding and unfolding a paper cup. He talked about training, about policy, about unverified access attempts. Every word sounded like he was reciting an incantation meant to protect him from the world. She didn't have a code, he said finally, voice small. The prosecutor let that hang there, quiet and heavy, like laundry on a line that won't dry. Then he asked, "Did you see her uniform?" "Yes." "Did you see the ambulance?" "Yes." "So why did you fire?" Mercer blinked slow, like a man waking from a loud dream. "I was following orders." There isn't a jury in the world that doesn't know the weight of those 4 words. History has carved them into our bones. We all know how much harm has been wrapped in that pretty excuse. And that was moment. She didn't raise her voice, didn't put on a show. She wheeled in a cart with the HOA's policy manual stacked on top like a patient in need of surgery. She turned it to page 12, subsection C, the one with the bold taser written under deterrence options. And she projected it onto the screen so every juror could see it wasn't a rogue guard, but a decision, signed and approved. She read emails from Philip Drake, the HOA president, phrases like "no exceptions" and "harden our perimeter." She showed meeting minutes where someone had asked, "What if it's an ambulance?" And Drake, calm, careful, had answered, "Emergency services can coordinate with our command post for verification." Except no one ever gave our county a command post number. It wasn't a loophole, it was a trap written in ink. The jurors leaned forward, pens forgotten in their hands. Didn't shout. She didn't need to. The words spoke for themselves. When the verdict came, it wasn't fast. But when the foreperson finally stood and said, "In favor of the plaintiff," the air shifted in that room. The HOA was found liable for wrongful death due to negligent and obstructive security policies. Damages, $5 million. A number heavy enough to make homeowners pale and the insurance rep scribble his calculator like it might conjure a time machine. Philip Drake didn't look at anyone. He just stared at the defense table's wood grain like maybe it could show him a map out of the building. But there was no map, no exit. That gavel strike didn't feel like victory. It felt like a beam cracking in an old house, groaning under the weight of rot that had been there for years. The HOA's lawyer resigned. Aegis Sentinel's contract was torn up before lunch, and we found out the tasers were never even authorized by the county in the first place. They were extras sold to the board by a consultant with a PowerPoint and a bag of fear. But Maple Ridge's wounds weren't healed, not yet. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, half angry, half ashamed. Some of them admitted under their breath that they had voted for the no exceptions policies. They thought they were protecting their families. They never thought it would cost someone else theirs. And me, I couldn't shake Mercer's words. I was following orders. Because in his voice, I didn't just hear Mercer. I heard every guard, every board member, every person who ever chose the rulebook over the human being in front of them. Sometimes justice doesn't look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a man in an ill-fitting suit whispering that he was just doing what he was told, and 12 strangers deciding that excuse wasn't enough anymore. But this story, it wasn't finished with Maple Ridge. Because the moment you let fear write your laws, fear doesn't stop at the gate. It comes for everyone. What happens after the gavel falls isn't fireworks. It's not victory songs or cheering crowds. It's slower, heavier, more like the sound a house makes when it realizes late at night that one of its beams has been rotting for years. The HOA's council resigned within days. Aegis Sentinel, the company that trained Mercer, the one that put tasers in guards' hands like toys, had its contract ripped up before lunch. And the truth came spilling out like water from a cracked pipe. Those tasers, never even authorized by the county. They were extra deterrents, sold by some consultant who knew how to package fear in a PowerPoint presentation and hand it to a board desperate to look strong. Philip Drake, the HOA president, vanished into paperwork and silence. He didn't apologize, didn't stand in front of neighbors with trembling hands. He sold his house in a hurry. You can always tell when a move isn't a plan but an exit wound. The for sale sign went up before the grass even needed mowing, and by the time it was down, so was his reputation. But Maple Ridge didn't bulldoze its gates. That's the part outsiders never understand. A community doesn't tear down the symbol of its mistake overnight. Instead, they rewrote the first rule in bold, black letters so big they nearly covered the page. No emergency responder shall ever be delayed, questioned, or blocked. Ever. New security didn't look like men with gadgets and tasers. It looked like a handshake with the sheriff's office. It looked like a volunteer watch led by a nurse who'd worked 30 years in trauma care. It looked like neighbors standing a little closer to one another at the mailbox, their voices quieter, their eyes softer. But healing isn't instant. I saw the cracks before I saw the repairs. At the rec center, they held their first meeting after the verdict. 200 residents. Folding chairs lined in uneven rows. Some people still clutched their arms like they were waiting for a fight. Some glared at like he'd been the one who betrayed them, like his lawsuit had drained their pockets instead of holding their board accountable. And then there was Carol. Carol wasn't loud. She wasn't even particularly well-liked before all this. She was the one who fussed over Shrub Heights and sent too many emails about recycling bins. But when the truth broke, she was the only board member who had the spine to admit it. She taped a letter to the clubhouse door before that meeting. "We let fear write our laws. I am sorry." It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and real has a way of cutting through the noise. Inside the meeting, ballots were passed out. Little folded papers that made soft, rustling noises as people whispered and marked boxes. One by one, the votes were counted. And just like that, Philip Drake was gone, stripped of his title, stripped of his little kingdom of rules. Some residents cheered under their breath. Some just sat stunned. One man I recognized, the same neighbor who'd once mocked for holding a protest sign by the gate, stood up, his face pale. He cleared his throat, voice trembling. "I voted for those policies," he said. "I thought I was protecting my wife. I never thought it would cost someone else theirs." Nobody clapped, nobody booed. A few people nodded, and that's what healing looks like in real life. Not applause, just quiet acknowledgement. But Maple Ridge wasn't free yet. Fear has a way of lingering like mold under paint. The emails, the newsletters, the endless rules, they'd trained people to believe safety lived in restrictions. That mercy was weakness. That hesitation was dangerous. I'd see it in the small things. A mother clutching her child's hand a little too tightly when a stranger walked by. A man double-checking his gate fob even though no one was behind him. The neighborhood had been cracked open, and while the rot was exposed, it would take time before people trusted each other again. He didn't back down. He used part of the settlement to start something new. A scholarship. The M. Hart Fund for Emergency Medical Studies. At first, just 2 checks sent to 2 kids who wanted to ride into other people's worst mornings and try to make them survivable. He told me once, standing by the community garden, "I don't want name to just be tied to tragedy. I want it to live in someone's courage." And it did. One of those students wrote him a letter. I read it twice. Your wife's story made me want to be the kind of medic who never hesitates. I'll carry her name in my pocket. That's the thing about tragedy. It doesn't disappear, but sometimes it plants something new, something that grows in the cracks fear left behind. And Maple Ridge, well, it was still learning. Some nights I'd drive past slow, windows down, just to hear the wind push through the flowers they planted by the community center. Kids rode scooters past the gate. Neighbors waved at our rig like they actually meant it this time. But every time I heard that little beep when the gate opened, I remembered the sound that had crawled under my skin. The zap, the silence, final breath trapped behind iron bars. And I knew Maple Ridge hadn't beaten a person. It had beaten a habit. The habit of choosing policy over mercy. Justice may have been written into the record, but it didn't erase the shadows. If anything, they grew longer after the verdict. A week after the trial ended, I found another envelope in my station locker. Same as before, no stamp, no return address. Inside, a single sentence. You think you won, but you just painted a target on your back. I'd been threatened before plenty of times. Drunks who didn't want an IV. Dealers who thought I was stealing their product when I was only bagging evidence for the cops. But this wasn't the same. Those threats were hot, reckless, born in the moment. This one was cold, calculated. The kind of note typed out by someone who'd taken their time. I kept it from at first. Didn't want her carrying my ghosts on top of her own. But I couldn't hide it from. I sent her a picture of the page, and she called me before my phone screen even dimmed. They're rattled, she said, voice steady, but I could hear the edge behind her calm. When power starts slipping, it panics, that's all this is. But it didn't feel like just panic when I walked to my truck at night and felt eyes on me. Or when I came home to find my front door unlocked, even though I knew I'd turned the bolt. Nothing stolen, nothing moved, just open, like an invitation or a warning. Was getting it worse. Flyers taped to his mailbox, words scrawled in marker, blood on your hands. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact like he carried a plague. He told me one night, standing by the garden they'd planted for, they don't see the board or the policy or the taser. They just see me, the man who took their safe little bubble and popped it wide open. I didn't know what to say, because he was right. But there was another truth too, one I saw in the quiet moments. Like the widow from Lilac Terrace, the one who signed his petition, leaving lemon bars on his porch without a note. Or the retired Marine who started walking his dog past house every evening, not because the dog needed it, but because needed someone nearby. It was a tug-of-war, fear pulling one way, courage pulling the other. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled to rebrand itself. Meetings turned into theater. New bylaws were drafted with flowery language, all about restoring trust and healing divides. But paper doesn't heal. People do. And not everyone was ready to forgive. One night, I caught sight of Carol again, the only board member who'd had the guts to admit fault. She was at the rec center, stacking chairs after a community forum. Her hair was messy, her blouse wrinkled, but her eyes, they looked lighter than before. "Do you think any of this matters?" I asked her. She paused, hand resting on the back of a folding chair. "Not all of it. Most of it is just noise, but sometimes one thing sticks. One vote, one letter taped to a door, one kid who decides to become a medic because of, that's what matters, that's what keeps me going." I wanted to believe her. But the truth was, the fear hadn't left Maple Ridge. It just changed form. Neighbors didn't openly argue anymore, they whispered. Didn't carry signs, they carried silence. The kind of silence that sits heavy between people at a mailbox or lingers too long after a wave that never comes. And me, I kept hearing that sound, that wasp-in-a-jar crackle that still lived in my bones. Every time I walked through the station bay, every time I lay down at night and the ceiling felt too close, it was there. Carried his own ghost. One evening I found him sitting at the edge of the garden, staring at the plaque with his name. His shoulders slumped, hands trembling in his lap. "They'll never forgive me," he said quietly. "Even the ones who sign the petitions, even the ones who bring cookies to the meetings. Deep down, they'll always blame me for making them face it." I sat beside him. "You didn't make them face it, reality did. You just refused to look away." He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on that plaque. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the garden gate swinging in the wind. That's when it hit me. Maple Ridge hadn't just been fighting over one woman's death. It had been fighting over the story it told itself. Were they a community that protected each other, or a community that protected rules? Were they neighbors, or just residents behind gates? And in that tug-of-war's name was the rope. Some days the pull toward fear still felt stronger. But every time someone whispered, "Thank you, too," or waved at our rig with a little more honesty, I knew the rope hadn't snapped yet. Fear doesn't disappear just because a jury calls it out. If anything, it clings, desperate to justify itself, and no one embodied that better than Philip Drake. After the verdict, he tried to keep his head down, sold his house fast, packed his life into cardboard boxes that disappeared overnight. But secrets don't pack neatly. They leak. And what leaked from Drake's files painted a picture uglier than anyone imagined. Emails surfaced, messages he'd sent to Aegis Sentinel before they ever signed the contract. Lines like "Our community needs to harden its perimeter," and "No exceptions, no excuses." Words that sounded strong in a boardroom but cruel when held up against last breaths. And there it was, buried in one thread about recent trespass attempts. Drake had been reacting to a teenager, a food delivery driver who punched in the wrong house number one night. That was his justification for turning Maple Ridge into a fortress, a kid with a paper bag full of takeout. But consultants know how to spin fear into profit. They sold him a presentation filled with bold fonts and stock images of masked intruders. They promised peace of mind for a price. And Drake bought it, hook, line, and taser. When that came out, neighbors couldn't hide behind denial anymore. This wasn't about one guard's mistake. It wasn't about policy misunderstood. It was about fear being purchased, polished, and handed down as law. I'll never forget the emergency meeting that followed. Saturday night at the clubhouse, fluorescent lights buzzing like flies. 200 residents, each holding a little paper ballot. Some still angry, some ashamed, some just tired. Drake stood at the front, trying to spin his story one last time. "We acted in the best interest of safety," he said, voice smooth but his eyes darting. "Our decisions were about protecting families, protecting children." But the room didn't buy it anymore. Carol stood up from the back row, her voice steady but her hands shaking. Protecting families doesn't mean killing someone else's wife. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. The ballots went in, folded, dropped into a cardboard box that had once held printer paper. The count was quick. The result was final. Drake was out. He didn't even wait to argue. Just walked out the side door, shoulders hunched, never looking back. And for the first time since Maple Ridge's gates had been built, I think people realized the bars weren't keeping strangers out. They'd been keeping humanity in. But here's the truth. Tearing down fear takes more than removing one man. It takes habits breaking one by one. The new board made their first act symbolic but powerful. They rewrote the security charter. The very first rule in bold black letters: no emergency responder shall ever be delayed, questioned, or blocked. Ever. No loopholes, no exceptions. Then they changed the face of security itself. The tasers were gone. The guards replaced by a partnership with the sheriff's office and a volunteer neighborhood watch. Not the kind that prowled with clipboards and flashlights, but the kind led by people who knew compassion mattered more than confrontation. The chairwoman? A retired nurse named Gloria, who'd spent 30 years in trauma wards watching lives slip through her hands. And something shifted. Saturday mornings, instead of arguing about shrub heights or Halloween inflatables on the Facebook group, neighbors gathered at the rec center to talk about kindness. They called it a safety forum, but really, it was about something else, learning to see each other again. One man I remembered, the same one who once sneered its protest sign, stood up in that meeting, eyes down. "I voted for those rules," he admitted. "I thought I was protecting my wife. I never thought it would cost someone else theirs." Nobody applauded, but a few nodded. And that's how real healing begins, not in speeches, not in claps, just in the quiet acknowledgement of failure. Didn't speak much at those meetings. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. His loss spoke louder than any microphone. But every now and then he'd hand out a flyer for the scholarship fund, the M. Hart Fund. At first it was small, 2 checks mailed out to students studying emergency medicine. But it grew, word spread, donations came in. And the man who'd been left alone with grief and threats began to see his name written in hope instead of sorrow. One of those students sent him a letter I happened to read. "Your wife's story made me want to be the kind of medic who never hesitates. I'll carry her name in my pocket." Fear had written Maple Ridge's rules, but now Sname was writing something else, a promise. Still, every time I drove past the community, windows down, I'd hear that gate beep as it opened. And in that small sound, I'd remember the bigger one. The zap that stole my voice, the silence that followed, his final breaths waiting on the other side. Because rules can change, faces can change, but habits linger, and the fight to keep them from coming back never ends. They gave me a medal. I didn't want it, didn't feel like I deserved it. Medals are supposed to be for heroes, and I still wake up at night to that sound. The wasp in a jar crackle, my own body crumpling to the ground whilst life slipped through the bars. But the county insisted. A ceremony at City Hall, the kind where the podium smells faintly of dust and the flags barely move in the air conditioning. Reporters snapping photos, hands clapping politely. I stood there, stiff in my uniform, trying to smile without letting it crack. The medal felt heavy when they pinned it to my chest, not the kind of heavy that makes you proud. The kind that reminds you of every second you wish you could take back. Was there, he brought flowers, white lilies, favorite. When the crowd thinned out, he walked up to me, looked me dead in the eye. "You did everything you could," he said. "Don't let the systems failure turn into your shame." It should have been simple words, but they cut deep, because I'd been carrying that shame like a backpack filled with bricks. And hearing him say it, his husband, the man who lost more than anyone, made me realize I wasn't the only one who needed to heal. After the ceremony, we drove back to Maple Ridge. Not because we wanted to be there, but because insisted. He wanted me to see something. The community garden sat just past the rec center. Fresh soil, rows of flowers, a plaque with his name. They called it "'s Corner" for some reason. An old inside joke, maybe. But the brass plate bore her real name, M. Hart. Children were running circles around the flowers on scooters. A woman was watering the plants, humming under her breath, and stood there, his hands in his pockets, just watching. "They wanted it to be more than a memorial," he said softly. "They wanted it to be a beginning." And maybe it was. Because Maple Ridge was changing. Slowly, awkwardly, unevenly, but changing. People waved at our rig when we drove by now, not the stiff, polite wave of obligation, real waves, like they actually saw us, not just the uniform. I'd hear little things too. A neighbor teaching kids how to dial 911 properly. A resident who once argued over trash bins now volunteering to organize CPR classes at the rec center. Tiny stitches sewing back together the fabric that had torn. But healing is messy. There were still whispers, still cold shoulders, still reminders that fear doesn't vanish. It lingers. You could see it in the way some folks double-checked their locks at night, or the way they glanced sideways at when he walked past. And yet there was something else too. A seed of humility. A recognition that maybe safety wasn't about walls and codes and tasers. Maybe it was about showing up for each other when it mattered most. Leaned down to brush dirt off the plaque, his voice barely audible. "I want its name tied to something more than pain. Now it will be." He wasn't talking about the garden. He was talking about the scholarship. The M. Hart Fund had started small. 2 checks mailed out to kids who wanted to become medics. But it was growing. Donations trickled in. Local businesses pitched in. Even a few Maple Ridge residents, quietly, anonymously, slipped envelopes into his mailbox. One of the students who received the scholarship wrote him a letter. I read it twice. "Your wife's story made me want to be the kind of medic who never hesitates. I'll carry her name in my pocket." That letter sat framed in his living room, not next to his photo, not on a mantelpiece, on a side table where he could see it every day without it becoming a shrine. And that's when I realized grief hadn't broken him. It had bent him, reshaped him, but not broken. We sat there in the garden for a long time, listening to the creak of the gate, the laughter of kids, the sound of water from a garden hose splattering on soil. And for the first time in months, I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe was right. Maybe we had done everything we could. And maybe the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the bylaws or the medal. Maybe it was in this, watching life continue, kids laughing where silence once lived. Because story wasn't just about how she died. It was about how a community finally woke up to the truth. That mercy isn't weakness. That rules without humanity are just cages. And sitting in that garden, I knew his name wasn't carved into tragedy. It was growing in every flower, every laugh, every student who carried her memory forward. You can't undo a sound once it's crawled under your skin, the crackle of a taser, the silence that followed, his last breath trapped behind a gate that should have opened. Those sounds live in me still. But I've learned something, you can drown them out with other sounds. Like laughter echoing down a sidewalk. Like a neighbor calling out, "Thank you," when our rig passes. Like the simple click of a latch that isn't locked anymore. Maple Ridge didn't bulldoze its gates. No community ever does. But it did something better. It rewrote its first law. Big, black letters that leave no room for argument. No emergency responder shall ever be delayed, questioned, or blocked. Ever. It sounds so obvious, doesn't it? Like common sense written on paper. But that's the thing about fear. It sneaks in and dresses itself up as safety, and before you know it, people are protecting their rules more fiercely than their neighbors. The new security wasn't men with gadgets and tasers. It was partnerships with the sheriff's office, volunteers in bright vests, a nurse who had spent 30 years watching people slip in and out of life. Safety stopped looking like weapons. It started looking like compassion. I drove through Maple Ridge again not long ago. The gate still beeped when it opened, but kids rode scooters past it now, not even noticing the sound. Neighbors stood at the rec center with coffee in hand, not to argue about shrub heights, but to talk about how to check on each other. A man I once saw mocking now nodded at him respectfully across the street. Healing isn't applause, it isn't banners, it's nods, it's quiet words, it's admitting I was wrong. And Maple Ridge had begun to learn that. Scholarship grew. The M. Hart Fund sent more kids into emergency medicine, each one carrying her name in their pocket. And every time a new medic strapped on a uniform because of her story, his voice reached further than the gate that silenced it. They even planted a garden by the community center. A plaque with her name, flowers that bent in the wind, bees buzzing soft against the petals. Some days on my time off, I drive past slow, window down, just to hear the wind moving through those flowers. And that's when it hits me, we didn't just beat a person, we beat a habit. The habit of choosing policy over mercy. The habit of mistaking rules for safety. The habit of forgetting that behind every gate, there's a human pulse waiting. But here's the hard truth, habits don't plead guilty. They don't vanish when you fire a board president or tear up a contract. They move. They find another neighborhood, another binder, another guard in another uniform, and unless someone says, "Not here, not again," they'll take root all over again. That's where you come in. Because I know some of you listening are living behind gates like these. Real gates, or the invisible kind, the ones that sit between you and doing the right thing. Rules, fear, the weight of what people will say. So let me ask you, if you were Mercer standing in that uniform with a manual in your hand, would you follow the orders, or your eyes? If you sat on a board, any board, how would you balance safety with basic decency? Where would you draw the line so that your rules never become a weapon? And if you were in that jury box, hearing those 4 words "I was following orders," how far up the chain would you make accountability climb? These aren't questions for courtrooms. They're questions for living rooms, for dinner tables, for community meetings where someone tries to convince you fear is worth more than compassion. Tell me where you land. Right, wrong, somewhere in the messy middle. Put it in the comments. Share it with the one person in your group chat who loves a good rule book as much as they love their people. Because maybe that's how we stop gates from becoming cages. And if you've ever had a moment where you chose a human being over a rule, and it cost you or it saved someone, I want to hear that too. because those are the moments that matter. We can't change what happened on Maple Ridge Drive. Hart's name is written into its soil now, but we can change what happens next time. The next time the siren wails, the next time the gate creaks, the next time fear whispers that a policy is safer than a pulse. We can make sure the only thing that opens faster than the gate is somebody's heart. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.